This is LSAT PrepTest 151, Section 1, Passage 1. It is a law passage about the Shelley versus Kraemer decision, medium difficulty passage. And this one's kind of sneaky because the author agrees with the court's result, but tears apart the reasoning. And if you don't catch that split, you're going to get the hardest questions wrong. Now, the main point is that Shelley versus Kraemer was right to strike down racially restrictive covenants, but the legal logic it used was broken, and it didn't even go far enough. Paragraph 1 is just the opening. It tells you what restrictive covenants are, and it tells you the court struck them down. Then the author says the decision is justly celebrated. Now that phrase matters later. You can read this paragraph at a pretty normal pace, but don't blow past the last two sentences. You've got the word however showing up, and that's where the real passage starts. Everything before however is background. Everything after it is the argument. If you're still summarizing when you cross that line, you want to shift gears. Now, paragraph 2 is the hardest paragraph. You want to slow way down here. That's where the author walks you through the court's reasoning step by step, and you've got to follow every link in the chain. Now, here's why it's tricky. The 14th Amendment only covers state actions. Covenants are private contracts, so there is no obvious state action to point to. So the court's solution was creative. It said that when a court enforces a private contract, that enforcement is state action. So the contract's terms get attributed to the state. And if the state couldn't pass those terms as a law, then a court cannot enforce them either. That is the logic. And it sounds clean, but it's not. But the author needs you to understand it before showing you why it breaks down. So don't skim this. Treat this like instructions you're going to be tested on, because of course you will in the questions. Now, paragraph 3 is where the author goes after that reasoning. And the most important paragraph is actually this one, not paragraph 2. Paragraph 2 builds up the reasoning. Paragraph 3 knocks it down. The author's first punch. If you take Shelley's logic and apply it consistently, the line between state action and private action disappears. Every private contract could end up in court. So every private contract would have to meet constitutional standards. And that is, of course, unworkable. And the author doesn't say it's unworkable in theory. Courts proved it, and they never applied Shelley's approach. Again, that is a big deal. The Supreme Court's own reasoning was so flawed that nobody, not the Supreme Court, not lower courts, ever actually used it. And then comes the example. Courts enforce settlement agreements that restrict someone's speech all the time. If Shelley's logic held, those agreements would be unconstitutional too. A law limiting that same speech would violate the First Amendment. But nobody treats those contracts that way. So the example is proof that Shelley's rule collapsed the moment anybody tried to extend it. Then the author lands their second punch right at the end. The court called the covenants themselves perfectly legal. The author thinks that's the deeper failure. The problem wasn't that courts enforced these covenants. The problem was the covenants existed at all. Their content was unjust, and the court should have said so, but it didn't. Now, the key move here is that two-part critique. The reasoning was unworkable, and it also missed the real target. Those are separate problems, and the questions likely ask about each one of those differently. The pattern running through this passage is a mismatch between surface and substance. The decision looks right, but reasons incorrectly. The covenants look like a private matter, but produce a public harm. The legal rule sounds logical, but falls apart in practice. Every layer has that same gap between how something appears and what's actually going on. Now, the trap is that most students will read this as an attack on the Shelley decision, but it is not. If you look back at that word justly in paragraph 1, you're going to see the author is not saying the court got it wrong. The author is saying the court got it right for the wrong reasons, and that's a more narrow claim. If you flatten that into saying the author opposes Shelley, you're going to miss the answer on attitude questions. And you'll also get pulled toward wrong answers that say the author thinks the 14th Amendment should not apply to housing discrimination. The author never says that either. Before you get to the questions, check yourself on these three things. First, can you explain why the court needed to find state action at all? Second, can you say what the author thinks the court should have attacked instead of enforcement? And third, can you explain what the speech example proves about Shelley's reasoning?